Evening Booktube. You join me on the completion of my latest book, which is Gabriel Garcia Marquez's 100 Years of Solitude, which I just finished yesterday, in fact. And what a riveting read. It was every bit as good as I remember it being when I first read it as a 17-year-old 7 years ago. And it actually was better this time round. I think the fact that I have read this already once and gotten my head around a lot of the confusing details of it during that first read helped me immensely for this second excursion of what is widely considered to be Marquez's masterpiece. Now, the book is set in the fictional town of Macondo, which is more or less an allegory for Marquez's native Colombia and for many of the events that went on in Colombia during not only his own childhood growing up, but also before he was born. A lot of the turmoil, both political and also economic, that assailed his native land is represented here in allegorical form. And with, I must say, very vivid and very elaborate detail. And what can I say? I immensely enjoyed every bit of this. I thought that the pacing of the book, of the story, was superb. I never felt that some bits were dragging or dull. The bit that perhaps made me the most excited was the long stretch in the earlier part of the book, or the middle of the book, where Colonel Aureliano Buendia is launching his never-ending rebellions against the government. And whilst he's doing this, he's up against not only the conservative opposition, who are seeking to crush his uprising, but also he's very much up against the double-dealing politicians who are nominally in charge of the Liberal Party in the civil war that he is fighting. And that was a particularly gripping part of the plot. I just found his character as mesmerizing and as charismatic as I did when I first read this book as a 17-year-old, and I think that he remains my favorite character in this whole novel. He was my favorite character when I first read it, and I think the second read has only solidified him, in my opinion, in my estimation, as my favorite character in this story. But he's by no means the only character who is of interest in the story. You have the godlike figure of Jose Arcadio Buendia, who is the founder of Macondo, and his wife Ursula, who is a very stern, very strong-willed matriarch, who I believe actually is alive for the whole of this book, or almost all of it. I think she dies towards the end of the book. She is a real presence for much of the story, and their relationship is fascinating. The details of how Macondo gets started as a town, whilst surreal and whilst fantastical, nevertheless feels like it's something that could have happened. And this is a sense you get actually throughout the novel. All of these fantastical events and occurrences that happen throughout the plot, although on some level they aren't quite believable, there is a certain aspect to them that makes them believable. Just the way in which Marquez writes these events, the way in which he characterizes his characters, the way in which he makes them feel like real people with real human motivations, real human failings and emotions. All of that really helps make what would otherwise be completely unbelievable to be somewhat believable, and gives it a degree of verisimilitude that makes this rather unsettling to read, because you feel like you're always on the border between fact and reality. And the fact that so much of what happens in the story is borrowed from real life events and from the history of Latin America just makes that even more so. You have Jose Arcadio Buendia and his wife Ursula. You have also Colonel Aureliano Buendia, as I've just mentioned. You have the character of Remedios the Beauty, who is taken up to heaven, presumably, or she is whisked away by some supernatural power from this earth and is never seen again. And I felt that this was reminiscent of the episode in the Bible where Elijah is taken up to heaven. We have the figure of there's another character called Remedios. I don't believe it's the same as Remedios the Beauty, but another character called Remedios, who is, I believe, 9 years old when she's married off to one of the Aurelianos in this book. And by the way, all the characters have the same name. They are either called Jose Arcadio, or Aureliano, or Amaranta, or some variant of those names. But this is part of the whole complicated story of the Buendia dynasty. That not only do they have the same names in every generation, but they also have the same character flaws, the same personality, the same physical appearance in many cases, and they are destined to repeat the same mistakes, as it were. There is so much incest that happens in this story that it boggles the mind, and Marquez does not spare any of the graphic details of these incestuous encounters between the different members of the family from the reader, nor does he shy away from his depiction of paedophilia in the story. Remedios, as I've already mentioned, this is not the same as Remedios the Beauty, if I remember correctly, but another Remedios character called Remedios is 9 when she is married to one of the Aurelianos in the story, and she actually dies in childbirth because she is in fact far too frail at that age to give birth, and so she dies in childbirth. And as horrifying as this is, I never got the impression reading this, like so many other people seem to have gotten the impression, that Marquez is trying to apologize or even romanticize a lot of what happens in here. I think this is actually meant to disgust the reader and to shock the reader with a no-holds-barred, uncensored, unadulterated portrayal of what actual historical mores were in Latin America towards aspects of sexual morality, like relationships with children or incest. And I think that this is actually meant to make the world of Macondo all that more alien and all that more revolting in some ways to a modern sensibility, because that helps to lend it the air of unreality that makes the story so engrossing in some ways, but also so powerful, because he's describing events that, in theory, could still happen today and still do happen in some parts of the world, horrifyingly enough. But of course, this is heavily fictionalized. This is his own fictionalized take on Latin American history. And even things like the arrival of the Americans to Macondo, the arrival of the Banana Company, mirrors what happened in real life with the United Fruit Company coming into Latin American countries and often destabilizing their politics and turning the governments that ruled these countries into puppets for their own will, so as to enable them to exploit these countries all the more efficiently. You have the penetration of Western culture, American culture, into Latin America, and you have the portrayal of this in this book, especially with the character of Amaranta Ursula, and the way in which she's packed off to boarding school by her mother Fernanda. She picks up all of these foreign habits. She comes back brings them back to the town of Macondo, even before she was sent off to abroad to study. She is picking up all sorts of foreign influences with regards to fashion, with regards to the way in which she presents herself, the books she reads, things of that kind. All of this is very much influenced by by the Americans, by the Western culture that's coming into Macondo. And I think that the way in which Gabriel Garcia Marquez puts this into his story is done masterfully, and is done in a way that's very thought-provoking, and needless to say, does create a lot of sympathy in the reader for the way in which Latin Americans were treated at this time by the Americans and by the imperialist adventurers who laid their hands to so much of Latin America's treasure. You have the incident in this book of the massacre of innocent protesters protesting against the Banana Company. And then you have the impact of propaganda, modern propaganda, in which the citizens are gaslit into believing that this never happened. And people go, there's at least one character who maintains that this did in fact happen, that he witnessed this with his own eyes, and he goes around to the other members of the Buendia family, insists that these events took place, and yet they tell him point blank that these events never happened. I think that was Marquez's way of trying to showcase the impact of government brainwashing and the falsification of history that has been such a big part of the conversation in 20th century history and thereafter. And I think that the way in which he portrays the gaslighting of an entire population by the people in power is, I think, done brilliantly, done evocatively, and is done in a way that will leave every reader, I think, who reads this book thinking much more deeply about these phenomena than they otherwise would. I should also say that the prose in this book is first-rate. Marquez's long sentences may take some getting used to, and that's something I struggled with when I read him as a teenager. But I think you'll find that his prose is lyrical. I think you'll find that the translation by Gregory Rabassa, which is the translation I read, is a very fine translation that reads very well in English, and I think gets the message of Marquez's story across well. There may be some things lost in translation, as invariably there are. I'm not an expert when it comes to the translation of works of Spanish fiction or works of Latin American fiction. I know much less about that whole industry than I do about, say, the translation of Russian classics into English. But I enjoyed the Rabassa translation, and it's a work I will return to, I hope, as time goes on. I've actually had this book on my shelf for quite a while, and incredibly, it never crossed my mind to pick it up and read it, because I always had some other book which I would much rather read. So I'm glad that I finally got to reread this after so many years of not having read it. And invariably, there was a lot of stuff which I had forgotten about, or simply didn't register with me the first time round, which on rereading, I now have a greater appreciation, I think, for those elements of the story that I didn't quite get the first time around. And that's one of the joys, I think, of reading a book like this, and especially of rereading a book like this, with so much detail, with so many layers to it. There are things in here which I still don't fully understand, I don't think. And I think yet another read will be necessary before I'm able to absorb a lot of what is in here. It doesn't help, of course, that I was reading it in a way that was rather distracted. This entire week I have been having trouble focusing on reading. A lot of it is the fact that I took a hiatus from reading recently to play video games for a while, and I think that just rebuilding the reading muscle and recovering that focus and that concentration is something which I will have to work more on. But overall, I had a very, very pleasant experience reading Marquez's 100 Years of Solitude. Uh, I'm not going to say too much more about the plot because I don't want to spoil it. Suffice to say that this story of the multiple generations of the Buendia family and the ways in which they bring themselves to ruin over many, many decades is a deeply, deeply enjoyable reading experience, but also in many ways a rather shocking one, because so much of what happens in here is so repulsive in many ways to our sensibilities. And you do have to sort of put that to one side and just enjoy the story. Otherwise, you simply will not be able to appreciate, I don't think, Marquez's genius. And I have seen so many posts on Reddit, in particular on the Men Writing Women subreddit, that takes a massive issue with the way in which Marquez writes women in this book. Many people seem to think that he's actually somehow glorifying or romanticizing paedophilia and sexism and all those things, which, given his very staunch leftist credentials, I don't think he was actually doing. But I mean, what can I say? I mean, people will have their opinions. I don't really care for the whole woke attitude towards literature that so many people have adopted nowadays. But they are entitled to their opinions, I suppose, ill-informed as they may be. But that is 100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel Garcia Marquez, a fascinating work of 20th century literature. In terms of books which I will read next, I'm not too sure. I have toyed with the idea of continuing with Marquez now that I've rediscovered him, and reading the other stuff by him I have on my shelf. I might reread Autumn of the Patriarch, which has been on my shelf for a while, and which I first read when my English teacher lent it to me when I was in school many years ago. Although I remember not quite enjoying it because I found the extremely long sentences very difficult, which you would at that age. I think now that I've read more of Marquez and I'm used to him more than I was, I think I would have a greater appreciation for it now. The plot of that particular story is about a dictator who refuses to die, and who is able to live to a very ripe old age before he finally gives way. But it's all about his anxieties and his insecurities and his unwillingness to give way to a younger man, because he's determined to continue ruling the country that he has ruled for so long. And I found that analysis, that psychological analysis of dictatorship and of despotism, to be interesting from an intellectual point of view, even if I found the story difficult to enjoy from a simple stylistic point of view. But revisiting that is always an option. The other option is that I might just read Love in the Time of Cholera, which I've never read before, and is also on my shelf for a potential read. So that's another avenue I could go down. But I might not go down either of those avenues at all. I might instead decide that I would like to read this biography of Frank Sinatra that has been in my pile of books in my room here for years now, and I have never actually taken the time to read it. Frank Sinatra is, of course, famous for being perhaps the greatest popular singer and entertainer of the 20th century, at least in America. And he is a hero of mine. He is one of my idols. I adore his music. I believe that he was a fascinating figure. He was awe-inspiring. What he achieved for popular music was simply unfathomable. What he did to extend the work done by great singers like Bing Crosby is incalculable. I think as an interpreter of the Great American Songbook, he was second to none in the way in which he could emote a lyric, in the way in which he could interpret the message of a song. And I will always have fond memories of when I first discovered him as a teenager on YouTube. And I discovered a video of him singing My Way. And that song resonated with me so powerfully in a way that I have never forgotten to this very day. So Old Blue Eyes may be my next target in terms of a read. This biography is written by someone called J. Randy Taraborelli, who I don't know at all. I have no idea who this person is. But I would like to think that this is a good biography and is one which I will take a lot of enjoyment from, and hopefully a lot of lessons from as well, because it is one of my ambitions that I may one day follow in the footsteps of Old Blue Eyes here and become a great singer myself, as someone who is rather fond of singing and who likes my 20th century music. I don't care for any contemporary music at all. I've been for a while now a stalwart defender of, admirer of, apologist for, and advocate for the great popular music of the 50s and 60s. And by that I mean the adult music, the easy listening, the adult contemporary stuff by people like Perry Como and Andy Williams and Dean Martin, who was another hero of mine, and Tony Bennett, another hero of mine. People like that, they are the kinds of singers I like. I don't really care for any of the contemporary stuff done today. And also country music as well. Country music, American country music from the 50s and 60s, from that same time period, is also music I enjoy tremendously. It's that and also classical music. They are my three genres of choice when it comes to music that I enjoy listening to. And I have been listening to a lot of that kind of music recently. So that is why Sinatra has been on my mind, and why I've been thinking of starting this book, which I haven't read yet and which is long overdue for me to read. So that is another possibility. There are also other novels which I haven't gotten to yet. There is Don Quixote by Cervantes, which has been on my shelf for forever, and I have not got round to reading it, and I should rectify that at some point. I could always give Pale Fire another go. I tried reading Pale Fire by Nabokov a while ago, about a year and a half ago or so, and I didn't agree with it. I struggled with it, and I ended up DNFing it, because I just found the narrative so dull. And I found it overwrought as well, and overdone, which is a shame, because I loved Lolita, and I loved Nabokov as a prose stylist, but I found Pale Fire tough going. So maybe I could give Pale Fire another go, or I could always go to poetry. I have plenty of poetry on my shelf, which I haven't finished reading yet. I have plenty of Kipling and Keats, which I could go through. The list is endless, really. But I hope to be back soon with an update as to how my reading goes, and as to what choices I've made in terms of reading material. So it's bye for now, BookTube.